Good evening to everyone in Asia. Good afternoon to everyone in Europe, and a good morning to those of you tuning in from the Americas. I'm Michael Plummer, the director of Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's seminar, COVID-19 and its implications for a frail democracy, the example of Myanmar. To address this fascinating topic, we're honored to have Dr. Michael Marett-Crosby, who's a graduate of Oxford University and now leads a group of charities that supports some 80 projects across Myanmar in healthcare, education, child protection, and road safety. Michael will give a talk of between 30 and 35 minutes, which will be followed by Q&A. I should mention that the Q&A is going to be governed by Chatham House rules, meaning that everything that's said and asked will be off the record. And this will be done after the presentation. Just one final thing, when you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A box on Zoom and not in the chat box. It's just much easier to manage the questions that way. So, Michael, over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening to those of you in Asia, good morning in the US. It's a pleasure to be here. Michael, thank you for your introduction. I've spent almost all day today on Zoom or its friends speaking to Asia, beginning rather early this morning with some interviews. During those interviews, one of my potential new members of staff said something that I wanted to share with you right at the beginning of this presentation. We were talking about healthcare and about the challenge that Myanmar faces at this time. And this particular candidate said, when I asked her why she wanted the job, I want to get my people to work together or we will die. It's not the kind of thing one commonly hears in an interview, but this is not a common time. What I want to discuss this afternoon then is not the medicine of COVID, but what COVID means in a transition state, in a fragile democracy like Myanmar. It presents vast challenges, yes, to the healthcare system, but also more broadly to what power means in this country. I'm not an academic expert in international development or in international relations. But I've come to be responsible for a group of charities whose work is primarily in Myanmar, to some degree in Bangladesh and in other countries in Southeast Asia. I'm going to refer throughout this lecture to Myanmar. Those of us in the UK and in the US will be slightly more used to the name Burma, which is still used in government-to-government communications. But I'm going to stick with Myanmar for the purposes of this conversation. I'm not going to speak on behalf of any of my charities or on behalf of any of the trustees. These are simply some personal reflections from my experience. I'm usually based between the UK and Myanmar. This is, I think, the longest time I've been away from Yangon for many years now. And the reason I think this is important is because of this. If we can move to the first slide, please. The picture that I hope you're seeing now, and the slide after that. Thank you. The picture that you're seeing now is an image that haunts me. It's why getting the response to COVID-19 right matters so much. It's a glimpse, I hope, for many of us, of a faraway reality. Next slide, please. It's about dealing with some grim problems that Myanmar, in common with many developing world countries, faces. I'll talk about how we're trying to do that about some of the actors involved in that. But I also want to talk about democracy and what COVID does to the hopes of democracy in Myanmar. When I first visited SAIS in Bologna, I was fortunate enough to attend a lecture on the great E.H. Carr. I think this quotation from Carr, who many of you will be familiar with as the kind of apostle of realism in international relations, this quotation matters. There is always an element of utopia in any kind of charitable activity. There is a hope that what we do can change the world. But we have also to be grounded in reality. Now, utopia is where Myanmar was for some years. Next slide, please. I'm going to run briefly through some elements of Myanmar history, just to share with you some sense of how this country has come to be where it is. This is, as many of you know, a country born out of colonial experiences, British and briefly Japanese. In parts of Rakhine State, they talk about not one or two, but 5 colonizations, as different powers in the region claimed control over the land. Independence in 1948 brought together in a single nation state something of a tatterdemalion of tribes, ethnicities, languages. I'm not sure anyone has ever reliably counted how many ethnicities and languages there are, at least 135, probably quite a lot more. This is a complicated country in which the borders were established in large measure for the convenience of others, people I suspect in large measure who looked and sounded a lot like me. It was also a country that won its independence in the absence of the hero of independence. General Aung San, the embodiment of Myanmar's hopes for independence, was assassinated before his dream could come to be made real. Right from the beginning, then, the man on whom the hopes of independence rested was absent. And into that absence came contrary forces. A democratic force for sure. UNU, whose name you'll see mentioned on this timeline, was an elected leader. At the same time, in juxtaposition, sometimes in collaboration, sometimes in conflict, were the Myanmar military. I'm going to use the Myanmar name for the military going forward, which is Tatmadaw. The Tatmadaw have always claimed to be the bearers of national identity. You'll see that in 1962, the democratic government of UNU was finally decisively overthrown, bringing into being a half-century of military rule. We can say a lot about that military rule and what it did, the damage it did. We are still in Myanmar living with many of those things today. That military rule has not ever completely come to an end. And here we come to the gap that exists in Myanmar between utopia or fantasy and reality. Some of us had posters on our wall as young people of Aung San Suu Kyi. Many of you will remember the moment when Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest, subsequently elected as a member of parliament in a by-election, subsequently again the victor of a landslide election in 2015. A genuinely, or at least in large measure, we think, free and fair election in which the people of Myanmar chose change. But, and this is very important and was often forgotten, not least by people like me at that time, the Constitution of 2008 established in Myanmar a hybrid system wherein civilian government had to share power with the military. That remains the case now, despite efforts to change it. Nevertheless, in 2012, there was an extraordinary optimism around what Myanmar could become. Next slide, please. It's captured for me in this single image. The embrace, the kiss indeed, between President Obama and Aung San Suu Kyi. When President Obama stood up to speak at Yangon University, there was a sense that anything was possible. And that utopia, if you like, that dream, felt tantalizingly within our grasp. But we forgot in that moment, and I think in many others, that Myanmar was never simple. That colonial background and the limits on civilian rule, all of those things remained in place, established, at least for the second one, in the language of the 2008 Constitution. Since 2015, if many of you have heard of Myanmar at all, it is for one reason, because of the expulsion, there are many other words one could use for it, of Rohingya refugees from Rakhine State. That is one dreadful manifestation of an old conflict, long existing in the country. One of many conflicts, and I'll show you some of the other ones later, that still plague Myanmar and which fundamentally affect how we respond to COVID and what COVID will mean. Next slide, please. To jump right forward to the present day, this is the Ministry of Health and Sport's COVID dashboard as of yesterday. And if you look at those numbers, one or two of you might not be absolutely perfect in your reading of Myanmar language, but if you look at the numbers at least, what you'll see is that at this point, Myanmar does not seem to be suffering too badly. There are many explanations for that. Explanations around inadequacies of testing, explanations perhaps almost also about the impact of climate on COVID, the impact perhaps of particular forms of social distancing in which Myanmar is more familiar. We don't know for Myanmar, as for every country, what the trajectory of COVID might be. But we are afraid that if the worst predictions come true, this could have a major impact on the population, on its health and economic prosperity, and on its long-term future. And things are being done. Next slide, please. My charities have been involved in a number of important steps. We'll go to the next slide, please. Including enhanced infection control, including new hospitals. To some degree, a transformed government communication system. I spent quite a lot of the weekend and this morning discussing how digital education, just as one small example, can be used to give the young people of Myanmar some experience of education, even at these times. There are lots and lots of practical things that can and are being done. Those are being done by a range of actors, Ministry of Health and Sport primarily, donors, bilateral, multilateral, charities like myself, and of course, many other people in Myanmar, just doing what they can for the best to mitigate this pandemic crisis. All of that is important, and I can say much more about some of those issues if people would like. But what I want to draw here is not so much on the immediate response to COVID, but what this crisis might mean for other deeper problems that a country like Myanmar faces. Next slide, please. The most important of those, arguably, is conflict. Since independence, Myanmar has never been without conflict. You'll see on this map, which is only accurate, I think, up to a point, some sense of where in this complicated country there are currently significant confrontations going on between the Tatmadaw and ethnic armed organizations. Ethnic armed organizations who are, in many cases, in control of territory, either completely or in part. It's been the case in Myanmar for many years that there are limits to the remit of the central government. In COVID, those limits become immensely important. If the writ of a healthcare system does not run through the country, well, COVID doesn't know that. It doesn't respect the borders that the particular histories of these conflicts might have established. So immediately, COVID raises anew the issue of power. Who has responsibility for healthcare in places where ethnic armed organizations have been in control for many years? Should a civilian government engage with such organizations? Is this the moment for ceasefire? It would seem obvious that the answer to that last question is yes. But of course, when wars have been continuing for 50 or more years, ceasefire is complicated. Peace is difficult. Next slide. And especially so in a war that no one pretty much has heard of, but a war that will fundamentally impact on the future, both for the Rohingya and for all the communities of Rakhine State. In the north of Rakhine State, a separatist organization called the Arakan Army is engaging in armed conflict with the Tatmadaw. They've done so on the basis of a separatist type of mission, which they call the Arakan Dream 2020. There have been assassinations, there have been abductions, civilian ministers have been shot at, some of my own colleagues have been shot at. And there have also, of course, been counterattacks by the Tatmadaw to relatively well-armed organizations, the Arakan Army and the Tatmadaw, engaged in a conflict for territory in land where the Rohingya violence and the sequence of attacks against those people over the last 50 years have taken place. This is a land that has been and is being fought over as we speak. In an article in Jane's, I think it's in Jane's Terrorist Review, I've got the reference somewhere, a very reputable scholar who I trust a lot describes this confrontation between the Tatmadaw and the Arakan Army as arguably Myanmar's most threatening insurgent challenge since independence in 1948. Next slide. And if you want an image of how that conflict and COVID are intimately connected, then glance at this screenshot from the BBC website reporting the death of a World Health Organization worker who was engaged in transporting COVID samples from Sittwe to Yangon when he came under fire. Conflict and COVID, therefore, cannot be separated. Power, conflict questions around the fragility of the state, questions around what responsibility the state should have, questions where fantasy and reality might come into conflict. All of these are raised by COVID. Next slide. I would want to suggest that alongside the huge healthcare implications of this illness, COVID inevitably functioning as a radical intrusion, bringing vast challenges to health infrastructure, and I can certainly say more about that. It is also both a mirror and a torch, reflecting and casting a brighter, sometimes dreadful light on some of these fundamental questions of power and its absence. Let's take the example of one possible solution in many countries to the current COVID challenge. And that is a vigorously enforced lockdown. We've seen in some countries, particularly that have a more Napoleonic tradition of policing, that kind of lockdown being enforced with a pretty strong message from the central state that you will experience increased surveillance, intrusion, whatever we want to call it, into your lives. That seems to be, at least for some, a viable option for dealing with COVID. But in a country where power is divided between the civilian and the military parts, where the police and all armed forces are under the control of the military, where the defence minister, the home affairs minister are appointed to the cabinet directly by the commander-in-chief. Such strategies could open the door to the remilitarization of the whole society. It is not long since Myanmar was under military rule. It's not inconceivable, at least, that it could be so again, and that the kind of responses that COVID might require would encourage the military rather than the civilian parts of the government to flourish. Next slide. There's an article in this week's Foreign Policy that identifies exactly this risk for Myanmar. Another issue that I think COVID must raise, both in Myanmar and I'm sure in many other countries, is the issue of nationalism. It's my sense, at least at the moment, that one impact of COVID is that it might have an influence in how we imagine the nation to be. I'm working here on the assumption that Benedict Anderson's broad definition of nationalism is right. I'm sure there are others who will know much more about the theory behind that than me. But that concept of an imagined community feels to me that it makes a lot of sense. Well, COVID is reshaping that imagination. We've seen, for example, Facebook posts in Myanmar advising that nobody should have any contact with any British person because the British are known to be carriers of COVID. What you see there is a re-expression of an, in a sense, quite familiar anti-colonial narrative, but retuned, if you like, by COVID. Much more significant are the Facebook posts advising people in the country not to welcome back any migrant workers themselves from Myanmar, because by virtue of their coming in contact with foreigners, they now become a danger. Thus, the nation is gently, or not so gently, redefined. Thus, the spectre of hate speech, which so haunted the violence against the Rohingya in 2017, starts to find new enemies. By that way, the nation becomes a smaller, tighter unit with a clearer sense of who enemies might be. Imagine, therefore, if, and this is not impossible to conceive, in one or more of those ethnic areas where the ethnic armed groups have control over healthcare, that one or more of those were to become a COVID hotspot. It's not inconceivable, though there's no evidence of it at the moment. If it did, then I suspect we would see again a redefinition of what the nation is, making clear that such people might always have been the enemy. That wouldn't be the government's position, but it could well become the popular position. I've touched then on the role of the military, on the limits of the civilian government. I should just mention that Myanmar is scheduled to have an election in November. In common with a number of other countries, not least the United States, Myanmar will have to conceive of what a COVID election might look like. We have also, I think, in this context, to think of the international response. What does COVID do to relationships between a donor community and the government in receipt of those monies? Well, one immediate change in terms of Myanmar's international perception is that it's no longer in the news. Our screens are dominated by COVID stories, other long-term struggles, battles, the sufferings of refugees. Those have dropped down the agenda. What does inattention mean in a country like Myanmar? The donor relation is very interesting. My charities receive quite a lot of money from donors, and those donors are in certain ways becoming very generous. They want to respond. Can we use the immediate crisis of COVID to respond in ways that both mitigate the now, but also prepare us for tomorrow? Donor funding is always capricious. It's always about to move to something else. Is this a moment when the donor system might be able, only might, to change direction? Next slide. And what, perhaps most fundamentally in terms of basic human rights, does COVID mean for the refugees and the displaced people? Not only the Rohingya, but also other communities displaced in Rakhine, in Kachin, in Kayah, and in other states and regions of Myanmar. This is a country that has experienced many, many years of struggle and conflict. There is an immediate issue of how to keep places like this camp safe. Social distancing is a mirage. It's a meaningless phrase. What can you do to help this kind of place survive? It's not, one might have thought, the moment to start talking about resettlement of refugees, not least because of the kind of nationalist narratives that I've already described. One answer that is sometimes suggested for camps like this is to ring fence them, to close them off from the outside world, to allow only very limited access of a small number of healthcare professionals in through what one might call a ring of steel. If a ring of steel is constructed around a refugee camp, does it ever come down again? And what happens to those refugees within that ring of steel when perhaps no one is watching? Next slide. One of the challenges I think we face in all of this is that there must be knowledge. Need alone is not enough to set power free. It's a quotation that I like and reflect on quite a lot. All of this then creates both an immediate medical crisis, a wider crisis in the economy, in education, in social welfare, in many, many other areas. But it also raises, to my mind, some more fundamental questions. Last slide. It raises questions to me about the limits of the powers of the state. Who, as I put in the last question there, who are the nurses and who carries the guns? And what happens if those two groups of people come to be the same? I think it's worth reflecting on what the role of the international community and donors is in this crisis, and I'm sure some of you are doing that already. Each country, quite rightly, has its own national concerns. So what is the donor landscape going to look like? Both now, when there are so many immediate needs, but also in the long term, when inevitably countries will be looking at their own recovery and their own needs rather before those of others. I wonder, in this context, but this is only a wondering, who is helped by condemnation? It's been very easy since 2017 for certain countries and others to almost give up on Myanmar, to stand on the edge and shout, proclaiming that somebody must do something to sort out the crisis. Given that COVID-19 is, in its grim way, a shared experience across the world, is perhaps condemnation at this point not enough? I don't have easy answers to any of those questions. Inevitably, a lot of my time is spent dealing with the crises of the moment, recruiting new staff who we will have to ask to walk into hospitals full of COVID so that they try to do the right thing. But there is a long-term concern as well. What will happen to COVID and a country with COVID, not now, but afterwards, when this crisis is long gone? It's for answers to those questions that I turn to you, thanking you for your attention this afternoon and inviting questions and discussion hereafter. Thank you.
Okay.